So recently, some noticeable anger has swirled around the Pathfinder 2e community as the Pathfinder 2e Remaster Preview Document revealed some, shall we say, controversial decisions around the use of spells inside of Pathfinder 2e. And to that I say, first time with Pathfinder? Today we're going to highlight some of what we know about the direction that spellcasting is going in the Pathfinder 2e Remaster on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that is apparently very easy to distract because if I'm being completely transparent, I didn't even realize there was a spellcasting controversy for like a week and a half. In my defense, I have a toddler in the house and most days I'm lucky to speak coherent English. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome back to Slingers Academy, my series that takes a look at spellcasting in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Since the very early days of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Paizo's approach to spellcasting inside of the game has, let's just be honest, produced some controversy with the player base. Some people really love what Paizo has done with spellcasting, and some people honestly feel let down by the overall power level or efficacy of magic inside of the game. There have been a lot of conversations that have gone on around spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e, and it is probably no surprise to most of the people who watch this channel. I personally like a lot of what Paizo has done with spellcasting in this game, but I do admit that there's been a lot of conversation and some controversy around the subject, and here recently some more controversy popped up. About a week and a half ago as of the recording of this video, so probably closer to 3 weeks by the time this goes live on my channel, Paizo released a preview document for the Pathfinder 2e Remaster, and while that document actually covered a variety of different topics, one of the topics that has gotten a lot of attention and focus is some of the changes that are coming to spellcasting. Now, as this is a portion of the game that I really enjoy, I was actually quite excited by some of the stuff that Paizo announced, and I was interested to see some of where Paizo is going with spellcasting in the future. But at the same time, there have also been some concerns raised by, well, some of what the preview happened to show. So what I'm going to do for today's video is I'm going to talk briefly about some of the changes that are coming. We're going to talk about new terminology, new mechanics, and then towards the end of the video, I'll actually get into some of the new controversies that are starting to pop up around the conversation of spellcasting. And we'll talk about what this all means for the game Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, a couple of things up front. First and foremost, I want to remind everyone watching this that what we got was a preview document, and honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if the preview is still a little, I'm not sure the right terminology here, shall we say, loose in its actual applicability to the final remaster project. It would not surprise me if some of what Paizo is showing ends up being changed between now and November, or if not changed outright, at least tweaked a little bit based on public response and feedback. This year has been one of the craziest years in the TTRPG industry that I have ever seen, and to that effect, I am allowing everything to have enough time to settle before I try to react, just because I know things have been changing at a very rapid pace, and change could still happen. The second thing that I want to say is, I realize this is a topic where people are likely to be very passionate, and allow me to say, I welcome responses from everyone on every side of this issue. Me, personally, I like a lot of what I'm seeing with spellcasting for Pathfinder 2e. I do have a few concerns, and we'll talk about those in the video, but if you were to take my overall response, I'm pretty positive on some of the directions that Paizo is going, and I think it's going to be overall good for the health of the game. That being said, I understand the concerns and the fears that people have, and as I mentioned a second ago, things have been changing very rapidly in regards to the tabletop industry as a whole, so I can understand being upset and concerned and wanting to voice those concerns. And the thing is, I have a fantastic community here, and I know this is not the first controversial topic that has been discussed on this channel, so I trust you to be respectful in the comments. Whether you like what's happening, whether you're terrified by what's happening, please join in the conversation and be part of the discussion, but also remember to be respectful of other people as we discuss these important topics. Ultimately, a healthy conversation can only be beneficial to Pathfinder 2e as a game and to the TTRPG community as a whole. Of course, that was also my subtle please do all the YouTube stuff nod. As always, the most important thing you can do to support this content is join in the conversation down in the comment section, but you can do all that other YouTube stuff as well, like, share, and subscribe. Check out Discord, check out Patreon, all of that helps to support the channel. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. So let's begin at the simplest implication of the Pathfinder 2e Remaster, which is new terminology. The reality is the majority of what Paizo is doing in the remaster falls under this category. Paizo is taking steps to separate their work from other TTRPGs in the industry and other legally dubious entities that might be out there. I think that was a reasonably polite way to say it. So, in effect, a lot of what Paizo has done with Pathfinder 2e is they've just gone in and modified the terminology of their game to very clearly and distinctly separate their work from what other companies have done. However, one of the things that Paizo notes in the Remaster Preview is that they're not just separating their work out, but they've actually gone in and made an active effort to improve the quality of the language that they use. One of their stated goals with the new terminology isn't just to replace terminology, but to make terminology more clear and more precise. And there are several places where you can see this in effect. One simple example is the change of the terminology spell level that's being moved over to spell rank. Paizo has discussed this before. The term spell level operates on a different scale than some of the other uses of level inside of the game. For example, spell level is usually half your character level, and that makes the use of the terminology level for spells a bit confusing. So Paizo used this opportunity to change spell level to spell rank, effectively separating those two terms out and making them a little bit easier to understand. But Paizo didn't just stop with spell rank. They actually took spell rank and looked at other areas of the game where a similar shift in terminology would be beneficial, and that's where you get new terminology like counteract rank as well. The mechanics of a lot of these items inside the game aren't changing, but the terminology is, and in most of the cases, you can see that Paizo has taken the time to make that terminology a lot clearer and a lot easier to distinguish. Another good example of this is the fact that the term focus component for spells is going away. The confusion here is pretty simple. Focus components were something you used to cast a spell, but that word focus overlapped with another rule set inside the game, which were focus spells. Focus components and focus spells don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, and it was an easy mistake for someone to make to think that you needed a focus component to cast a focus spell, or that all spells with such a component needed to be a focus spell. In order to get rid of that potential confusion, focus component is now being changed to locus. The mechanical implications here are exactly the same, but the terminology has been changed to make it more clear. Most of the changes that Paizo is looking at doing fall under this new terminology heading. Essentially what Paizo has done is They've taken an old term, they've replaced it with a new term, and yeah, you got to get used to a new term, but other than that, you're not really learning anything new. There is a little bit of a muddy category here, because there are some changes where Paizo is essentially taking one piece of the game and moving it to a different section of the game. The mechanical heading is changing, but the actual way it works stays the same. A good example of this is actual spell components, which Paizo is doing away with. Previously, you had components like somatic and verbal, which really existed as a way of hiding certain traits for the spell. A verbal component added the concentrate trait to a spell, and a somatic component added the manipulate trait to a spell. So essentially Paizo looked at those components and said, we don't need them. We can just use the traits that they represent. So when new spells are published for Pathfinder 2e, on those spells you're going to see traits like manipulate and concentrate that essentially hold all of the information that once existed under spell components. The rules here are exactly the same, but they've shifted from one section of the rules to another section of the rules, so it's a little bit more complicated to get used to, but still at the end of the day, you're not necessarily modifying what you need to know to play the game. Two more examples of this phenomenon are the new special basic actions Sustain and Dismiss. Previously, spellcasters could learn how to sustain a spell and dismiss a spell, and now they've just shortened those basic ideas into specialty basic actions that spellcasters use. And the big change here essentially becomes sustain and dismiss now represent spells and items rather than having separate sustain and dismiss for spells and items. Essentially, by moving sustain and dismiss into specialty basic actions, they are cleaning up the rules and making them a little bit more straightforward, but the overall impact of what they mean to the game is pretty negligible. But as I've mentioned, a lot of what Paizo is doing in the remaster is shifting terminology around. You're going to see creatures and planes and languages that all have new names, but their role inside the game is essentially the same. And while it's a little frustrating to learn new terminology, again, I don't think it's too big of an issue. Now overall, I do think that the new terminology, at least in time, is going to be a good thing. With Paizo taking the time to clarify rules and make them more precise, that's going to be good for the game. I think there's going to be a period of time where, as players, we're going to have to learn something new, and that's going to be a little frustrating. But I think after a few months, we're all going to look back on the new terminology section, and for the most part, we're going to say, yeah, that was probably a bunch of good changes. I do have a few frustrations here, and a good example I can highlight of my frustrations under new terminology would be things like the somatic and verbal components that are being dropped from the game. One of my favorite pages in Secrets of Magic was just a discussion of what somatic and verbal components looked like in Pathfinder 2e that I thought was very creative and very well done. And one of the things that I've enjoyed about Pathfinder 2e is that Paizo has taken a lot of classic ideas and really put a very intelligent and enjoyable spin on them. And now it feels like Paizo is being forced to abandon some ideas more out of a sense of corporate safety than out of an actual sense of trying to make a game that they want to make. Obviously, I'm not blaming Paizo here, but it still hurts a little bit when you lose things like that. Stepping beyond new terminology, we find the next level of changes that we have to deal with, and this is where things start to get a little bit more stressful for players, and that's where you have what are functionally new mechanics, or at the very least, new takes on old mechanics. Now again, Paizo has said that their goal here is to make sure that the mechanics are clear and easy to implement, so a lot of these mechanical shifts and changes are at least oriented towards trying to improve the game. A good example of this are the changes coming to the refocusing rules in Pathfinder 2e. One of the things that has been clarified under the remaster is any class ability or feat that gives you a focus spell will also give you a focus point, making it a lot easier to track how many focus points your character actually has. On top of that, they're removing the restriction from the refocus activity that you have to spend a point before you can refocus to gain a point. Now you can just refocus to gain a point and move your total on up to a higher amount, up to whatever your maximum may be. As long as you have adequate time, you can fully refocus even if you haven't used any refocus spells in your previous encounter. Honestly, that's a good change. They're removing some of the focus spell feat tax and they're making things a lot clearer. However, in the discussion of refocusing, we can see something I noted earlier about the fact that I consider the preview document to be a work in progress, because Paizo employees have actually had to come out and clarify something that I just discussed. You may remember a moment ago I said your number of focus points equals your number of focus spells, and the first time I read that I was thinking, wait, did they remove the cap on focus points? No, they didn't. They forgot to put a note in the Remaster Preview saying that the cap of 3 focus points is still present, meaning there was a lot of confusion around that particular rule, and Paizo had to clarify. Not gonna lie, I was a little bit shocked when I first saw that discussion of the refocus activity, and I appreciate the fact that Paizo has offered clarification, because that was a big misunderstanding. So just take that as an example that when it comes to the new terminology, new mechanics, I do consider the preview to be a work-in-progress style document, and I do expect to see some changes and clarity when the final version comes out. Now, one of the most discussed changes of the Pathfinder 2e Remaster are the changes to alignment, and the changes to alignment are going to have some impact on spellcasting. A lot of the old alignment distinctions like law, chaos, good, and evil, those are going away. But in their departure, there are a couple of mechanics coming in, and both of these mechanics are very interesting to me. The first one I want to talk about is spirit damage. Previously in Pathfinder 2e, there was alignment-based damage. Good damage, law damage, chaos damage, evil damage. You could fire out spells that dealt damage on the basis of alignment. Now, I don't want to dive too deep into the mechanical implications of this, but the change that is coming, essentially what Paizo is doing is replacing alignment damage with a new type of damage called spirit damage. And spirit damage is damage that directly attacks the spirit of whatever it is you're fighting. So if I were to blast someone with a spirit attack, I would be damaging them, but in particular I would be damaging their spirit. Where this type of damage is particularly useful is when you're dealing with creatures that are possessing other creatures. So for example, if you have a ghost or a poltergeist that has infested a person or an area, you can have a spellcaster fire off a spirit damage spell and directly attack the entity that is causing that trouble without actually damaging any people or objects around that entity. It is a relatively simple change going from alignment damage to spirit damage, but functionally what this does is give low-level spellcasters a more direct tool for dealing with spiritual threats such as ghosts, haunts, or what have you. There's a lot about the old alignment system I'm going to miss. If you're a fan of this channel, you know that. But I have to say, the switch over to spirit damage actually makes low-level spellcasters more effective in a scenario where previously they struggled. The other mechanical change that's coming in with the departure of alignment is the idea of the holy and unholy traits. Essentially, if you're a servant of a deity, you have the option to sanctify yourself to holy or unholy. Not every deity requires it. Some deities give you a choice. Some deities expect you to sanctify. But if you sanctify, your character gains that particular trait. So if you're a cleric of Iomedae, you would sanctify yourself to holy, and then your character would become holy for purposes of game rules, and then would interact with holy and unholy objects based on that trait that your character now has. I know that's kind of a long-winded statement, so let me be a little more direct. If your character sanctifies themselves as holy, then when that character casts certain spells, the spell gains the holy trait. Long story short, if you're holy, your spell's holy, it's more effective against unholy entities. Now, the previous expression of alignment in Pathfinder 2e did allow for good versus evil and some of these mechanical implications to exist, but I do think Paizo has found an effective way of putting the battle between good and evil, the holy and unholy, into the game in a meaningful way. I think it's going to mesh reasonably well. So I do like the fact that Paizo has included the holy and unholy traits. As a quick aside, I really wish that Paizo would also allow PCs to sanctify themselves to, what's a good term for law and chaos? Let's say order and entropy. I mean, seriously, the Hell Knights are part of Galarian lore. Sanctifying yourself to order feels like it should be part of the game. I'm not saying I agree 100% with the changes that Paizo's making here, but I do think that Paizo has found a good way to implement an alternative to the alignment system that is still going to be meaningful inside the rules. I think it's going to mesh well with the game, so overall I think it's a positive, even if I'm totally pushing Paizo to spin some kind of lore-related event into their world so that the option to sanctify to order and entropy exists. I think it needs to happen. Still, overall, the basics are good. However, there is a very interesting nuance to the holy and unholy traits that has me intrigued, and honestly, my thoughts here are so early that I'm still not 100% sure where I want this to go, but catch something important about this. Your character gains the holy trait. Your character casts spells, causing those spells to also gain the holy trait. The traits of your character influence your spells. That is a very interesting mechanical nuance that I don't think Paizo has really explored yet. Honestly, the closest we have to this would be something like the meta magic trait, but even that feels a little bit different. The idea that some inherent quality of your character bleeds over into your spellcasting, that is cool. It makes me think back to some of the very early days in World of Warcraft where your race in World of Warcraft could allow you to unlock unique spells that no other race inside of the game could have. Now, if you remember that time frame, you will also remember that it was a balanced nightmare. So, this whole tangent that I'm talking about right now is definitely one where Paizo would need to tread very carefully to make sure that it's beneficial to the game, but there is some serious potential here, and I'm excited to see where it goes. There are a lot of other places where new mechanics are going to be coming in because of the Pathfinder 2e remaster, and again, most of these new mechanics, most of these new changes are really just minor shifts in how things are working. Alignment, by and large, is the biggest one, but you're also going to see areas where certain items are being reworked. For example, talismans are getting reworked, and certain things like the Staff of Evocation are obviously going to need to be redone. There are a variety of other mechanical changes coming as well, but overall, with these mechanical changes in Pathfinder 2e, you feel like Paizo has an emphasis on they want to improve the game, they want to streamline the game, they want to find new and interesting ways to approach the game, and I think by and large Paizo is being successful in that effort. A lot of the new mechanical shifts and changes feel like Paizo is finding fun and interesting ways to explore their work. But there are some controversies. There are two particular controversies that have really shown up around the subject of spellcasting as a result of the Remaster Preview Document, and in a twist that at least I find amusing, the one that seems to be hitting the internet the hardest is not the one hitting me the hardest, so we'll talk about the one that is leaving me feeling a little bit rough, and that's the change to wizard schools. The old 8 schools of magic, abjuration, conjuration, divination, enchantment, evocation, illusion, transmutation, and necromancy are going away. I understand Paizo's reasons why, but honestly I liked those schools of magic, And shifting away from those schools of magic, even if it's a legal necessity, is just something that hurts me. And really there is nothing that Paizo can do to 100% take that sting away from me. That being said, Paizo's approach to the new wizard schools of magic is a little bit of a hard sell. Essentially, the new schools of magic for wizards are going to be referred to as curriculum. That, honestly, is a flavor win for me. And this curriculum represents the type of spellcasting that the wizard focused on at their university. The example that's given to us in the preview document is the School of Mentalism, which seems to combine large chunks of what illusion and some of enchantment used to do into this new hybrid school of sorts that just focuses on messing with people's minds. Now, one thing I'd like to say up front about the new wizard schools here is, from a flavor perspective, I actually like this. The School of Mentalism is very creative and interesting. I actually have a Can Pathfinder 2e build short coming out very soon that's going to reference the School of Mentalism and show how you could use that to build a character. I do think these are very creative and engaging. The hang-up that a lot of people, myself included, have is these new schools are just limited. If you are an evocation wizard, you might have 5 or 6 or more different spells of your school at every spell rank that you could cast as an evoker, and the new schools that are being presented are typically going to have 2, maybe 3 spells as part of their curriculum at any given spell rank. Mechanically, the options for wizards are going to shrink. Going from 5 or more options down to 2 or 3 options, let's just be honest, it's going to hurt. Now, there are a couple of things to say here that can take away the sting a little bit. Number one, there is an important note in the section on wizard school curriculum that at Game Master discretion, additional spells that are appropriate to a school can be added to the curriculum. So if you as a player and your Game Master agree on it, you can come in and add a couple of spells or maybe switch out a couple of spells and customize that curriculum list to something that is more focused on what your wizard wants to do. And at the end of the day, as long as Game Masters are being reasonable and are willing to work with their players, I think that's going to alleviate a lot of the stress here. The other thing that helps here is Paizo has also mentioned that they are working to combine the effects of certain spells where they feel it is appropriate. You may have had 2 spells that were separate, mostly because of legacy considerations, where now Paizo's just saying, you know what? Let's take both of those options and stick them in a single spell. That small but noticeable condensing of the spell list is going to help in this regard, but still I think it's fair at the end of the day, if you're a wizard player looking at the change from the old schools to the new schools, there's going to be a little bit of a sting and you're just going to feel that. Are the new flavor wins of the new wizard schools worth the constricting of wizard options? That's going to kind of be a personal debate that you have to settle for yourself. If I'm being fully transparent, while I like what Paizo is doing, it still hurts, and this is one of the particular aspects of the new spellcasting that's going to be the hardest for me as a gamer. I'll adjust, I'll get used to it, but it is going to be a struggle. The other controversy, which honestly is the one I completely missed for a week and a half, is a lot of spells, especially cantrips, are getting a noticeable change in their damage. Currently in Pathfinder 2e, there are a lot of spells, particularly cantrips, whose damage will include a dice plus your ability modifier. So for example, if you were a wizard who was casting Produce Flame, you would get 1d4 plus your intelligence modifier to damage. In the Pathfinder 2e Remaster Preview, Paizo highlighted a lot of spells that are going to be coming into the remaster, such as the Ignition spell, and those spells, rather than having a dice plus your ability modifier, simply have a pool of dice for your damage. So for example, Ignition, which is replacing Produce Flame, is just going to deal 2d4 damage. Where this is sparking a lot of controversy, and if I'm being honest, understandable controversy, is 1d4 plus 4 is just mathematically better than 2d4. Even if the range of numbers is the same, the average of those numbers are different, and functionally, switching from the former to the latter is going to result in a slight but noticeable debuff of the wizard class, particularly at low levels. In fact, if you want to dive into the numerical implications of all of this, Ronald, the rules lawyer, has done a fantastic discussion of this, so I'm going to link to his video in the video description. Paizo is going from dice plus ability modifier to a dice pool, and that switch to a dice pool is lowering the average damage for casters overall. I think most people would agree that once you get to a certain level, the difference is going to be so negligible as to be unnoticeable, but at low levels it is going to be a concern, and that has caused a lot of people frustration online. And now that we've described that controversy, the time has come for me to reveal why I am both easy to entertain and distract, and I explain why honestly this controversy just completely missed me. Please understand I'm not taking shots at anyone here. This is just an honest reflection of how I viewed this change the first time I saw it. I loved the change. And I loved the change because of a very simple but important premise that I have known for years as a storyteller. If you want people to play spellcasters, let them roll a lot of dice. It's addictive. Seriously, over the years of storytelling, I have known lots of players who have come into TTRPGs and they've looked at characters like fighters and rogues and they've been all about playing that, but the instant you mention a spellcaster, they're just like, ugh. I have one very good friend who for years refused to play a spellcaster, and his specific reason was, and I quote, "Magic makes my head hurt." Well, several years ago, one of my friends who was a game master showed me a trick that they use when they want to get people interested in playing a spellcaster, and this was back in the D&D 3.5 days. If you played, you know what I'm about to mention. They used Scorching Ray. Basically what they did is they took spells like Scorching Ray, Fireball, or other spells where you just got to load up on a lot of dice and roll them all at once. They took those spells, showed them to players, and got players addicted to rolling multiple dice at the same time. And even if the actual damage output wasn't super absurd, the actual physical experience of rolling multiple dice was just so addictive that people who initially rejected spellcasters would say, "This is fun." So when I saw the Remaster Preview and this change where they're taking 1d4 plus the ability modifier, taking that ability modifier away and changing it to 2d4, my initial response, unedited, unfiltered, was, oh, they want players to have more fun. Like, rationally I know that 1d4 plus ability modifier is stronger. But if I had to pick which one I was going to do, I'd grab the 2d4 because rolling multiple dice is just fun. I like the sound of it. So I looked at this change from Paizo as Paizo giving a unique play experience to spellcasters. Rolling multiple dice at once is something that martial characters only do at higher levels. Well, unless you're a rogue, but that's sneak attack. Martial characters roll 1 dice to attack, roll 1 dice for damage, and then have modifiers on top of that. So having spellcasters have a unique dice mechanic in the fact they're rolling multiple dice for damage at once makes them feel different at the gaming table and makes the experience feel unique. For me, the remaster changes were appealing because I'm honestly less concerned with play optimization and more concerned with just the positive kinesthetic experience of playing the game. Now, I fully understand that if you step out of my silly childish brain and look at the game from a optimization standpoint, which is important to a lot of players, I can completely understand why the changes to spell damage, particularly cantrip damage, and particularly low-level cantrip damage, where spellcasters can suffer. I can understand why that's a problem for people. It just completely skipped me because my brain is weird like that. What I do think Paizo is doing to address some of these concerns about low damage and low level spellcasters, and to be honest, I'm kind of pulling this point from Ronald the Rules Lawyer's video, but one of the things Paizo is doing is they're focusing on the utility, the debuff, the interesting effect aspect that low-level spells can have inside the game. Though a spellcaster may not have the highest damage output, Paizo is taking the time to focus on interesting debuffs, unique effects, utility for a given spell. They're looking for ways to make each spell a unique part of the spellcaster's kit, where even if the damage is not the best, the spell is still fun and entertaining to use. So for me personally, I'm happy with a lot of the spell redesigns that I see going on, even if I do acknowledge that from a purely mathematical perspective, there is some power being lost. The overall loss of power isn't as big a deal for me. Still, this is totally an area where if you disagree with me in the comments, I would understand where you're coming from. So with all of that being said, that's a quick look at some of the changes that Paizo has shown us with the Remaster Preview Document. Now, one thing I would like to say is I do enjoy the Slingers Academy series that I've done for this channel, both long-form content and a lot of the old shorts videos that I've done. And my goal is, when the Pathfinder 2e Remaster comes out in November, I'm going to be checking out what the final version of spellcasting looks like, and I'm going to be retooling a lot of my old Slingers content, starting up again in 2024, because I do think spellcasting is a very fun part of this game, and I do want to help players approach and understand this aspect of Pathfinder 2e. So right now the plan is simple. I'll get the new books in November, I'll read them over the holidays, and starting in January, you're going to see a lot of the Spellslinger content that I used to do coming back on this channel, retooled and re-geared to help with the new remastered content. Another thing I plan on doing is revisiting some of my classic introduction series, as a lot of spellcasters are going to have a lot of new content. So my goal will be to, over time, go back to some of those classes that I did a long time ago and look at what the new version is like with the Pathfinder Remaster. Why yes, Paizo has found a way to make me redo the Oracles video. Sometimes I have issues with Paizo. Sometimes. But essentially what I would like to say here is, while I think a lot of what we're seeing at the moment represents a work in progress for Paizo, when we get the final big picture of what spellcasting is going to be like going forward in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I do plan to cover that content, I do plan to address that content. I think it's an important part of the game, and I want to have resources available for players so that they can enjoy that part of the game. But with all that out of the way, the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about some of the changes that are coming to spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e with the Remaster project? Let me know your thoughts on the new terminology, the new mechanics, and some of these new controversies that have sprung up in and around spellcasting. Let me know what you think. Leave your thoughts and ideas, and if there's anything about spellcasting that I forgot to mention, be sure to throw that down there as well. And don't forget to do all of that other YouTube stuff. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Check out my free Discord and my Patreon. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.